Hello, I'm Duncan Fraser, Director of Useful and Kind Unlimited, a charity which aims to develop pro-social behaviour and leadership, especially with young people. Welcome to our podcast series, which aims to explore how being useful and kind to yourself, to others, and to the world can make things better. Today, our themes are central to everything we do at Useful and Kind, namely compassion and forgiveness and how they're related. Our SO model, being useful and kind to self, others and world, is totally imbued with both compassion and forgiveness. And we're thrilled to be joined today by two of the world's experts on these subjects. Paul Gilbert is the poster boy for compassion. His iconic book, The Compassionate Mind, is a definitive and wide-ranging exploration of the theme. Paul is a British clinical psychologist and founder of compassion-focused therapy and compassionate mind training, an author of over 18 books and hundreds of papers. Before retirement, Paul was head of the Mental Health Research Unit for Derbyshire Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust, and he is Professor at the University of Derby. He's a Fellow of the British Psychological Society and was President of the British Association for Cognitive and Behavioural Psychotherapy and has served on government committees. Paul is passionate about not just researching, but helping folk in compassionate ways to understand who they have been, who they are, and who they can be. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Duncan. That's a lovely introduction.
Marina Cantacuzino is an award-winning journalist who, in 2003, in response to the invasion of Iraq, embarked on a personal project collecting stories of people who had lived through trauma and injustice and sought forgiveness rather than revenge. After organising an astonishingly successful exhibition with the encouragement of Anita Roddick and Desmond Tutu, she founded the Forgiveness Project and started speaking widely about forgiveness and restorative storytelling. Her outstanding book, The Forgiveness Project, Stories for a Vengeful Age, is a must-read for all of us involved in the knotty and complex issues involved in change-making and making the world a better and more forgiving place. Welcome, Marina.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So I'm wondering, when you both first realised that you had the chance in life to make a real difference to our thinking on compassion and forgiveness. Paul, you first.
Well, my personal story is an interesting story. I grew up in Nigeria, in the outback of Nigeria, and with obviously there was immense poverty, but I think it was 1995, and I was watching a BBC documentary on the Holocaust, actually, and it went on for 2 or 3 hours, and it was extraordinary. And they played Gorky's Third Symphony, and I had young children myself, and so I was quite tearful through some of that program. And I was never quite the same, because it sort of suddenly hit me that humans are potentially one of the nastiest, vicious species that have ever walked this planet, and we have to do something about it. And so, in fact, humans are a species of extremes. You know, we can be the really, really terrifying in our tortures and slavery and some of the things that Marina has seen. But equally, we have the potential to be quite extraordinary. I mean, you know, people have laid down their lives trying to save, doctors have laid down their lives trying to save COVID patients and so on and so on. So we have these two extremes. So the question is, how can we stimulate the goodness, if you like? How can we stimulate the desire to be helpful, not harmful? So that's basically what challenged me, really, is how can we address the dark side of the mind? And the dark side of the mind also turns up in mental health problems, where people become very persecuting of themselves, or they hear hostile voices, or whatever it is. So that's my personal, I mean, you wanted me to talk about the personal journey. That was my personal journey of just really recognizing we have to stand against the dark side.
Fantastic. And Marina, when was it that you first realised you had a chance to make such a difference in this field?
Well, I think the thing that led me there ultimately was having a disabled brother. In fact, a terminally ill brother who died at 17. And I knew from a very young age he was going to die. So when writing was always about the only skill I had. And so when I thought that I wanted to write, it became very obvious that I would try and write a story about growing up in a family with a disabled sibling. And it was in the days of pre-email. I just sent it off to the Guardian, hoping, and they published it. And it gave me the confidence that I could write well enough. And from then on, I really focused on storytelling and on outsider narratives, on people who were overcoming personal traumas and pains and suffering. That was like kind of focus. And I did that for 15 years. But it was someone else's story that actually led me to forgiveness. And it was just watching, it was during the Iraq, just after the invasion of Iraq in about 2003. And I was watching local news, and there was this story of a father whose young child had been killed in a hospital in a sort of medical blunder error. And it was the inquest. And as he came out, the journalist sort of thrust the microphone under his nose and said, you know, how do you feel being in that room with them, the doctor who had caused the harm? And I expected to hear quite understandable words of retaliation and litigation. And instead, he described how he'd seen the doctor and how he'd walked across the room, how he'd held the doctor in his arms and said, I forgive you. You know, I want to know that I forgive you. It was a mistake. And I know it was just a very unusual moment of television. It was the bellicose language of payback and retribution was all around us at the time, the black and white thinking of, if you're not with us, you're against us. And it was because of that, I was a journalist, you know, I'd been working as a freelance journalist, as the main breadwinner, bringing up 3 children. And it was because of that, I thought I wanted to focus on forgiveness and reconciliation, compassion and empathy. And those were the stories that I wanted to collect. So that led me to then creating that exhibition, which you mentioned, the F-word exhibition, which then led to, you know, the enormous interest of that exhibition, which led me to working in this field of exploring forgiveness for the last 17 years.
Fantastic. So really interesting personal stories. And I just want to continue that a bit. I mean, obviously at Useful in Kind, we believe that compassion is absolutely central to what we do. Not just the deep power of empathy, as, you know, as Rogers said, to feel others' feelings, knowing that we aren't them, but rather being stirred to act. Paul's lovely definition of compassion includes that, the actually wanting to do something. So I'm wondering, from your own early years, who was your role model for compassion when you were little? Did you have someone? Was someone compassionate and kind to you when you were little? Marina?
Well, I'm sure many have said this, but I will go for my mother. I think she was a huge influence. She was sort of upper middle class woman. She died a couple of years ago, who'd had almost a Victorian upbringing, and she was sort of uptight in many ways, and she had a vicious tongue as well, but she was incredibly kind, and I felt very safe with her. Someone I once know said about their mother, who they didn't feel was they said they never felt safe with their mother, and they had this image of a woman with a huge skirt, and he said to me, I never felt as a child I could run and hide under the skirt of my mother who would protect me. And when he said that, I thought, I've always felt that I could. But most of all, she was kind. She was kind to everyone. She would talk to everyone, despite this rather rarefied upbringing. And she always said sorry. That was the other thing. She was brilliant at saying sorry if we ever argued. And I thought that was a great lesson, actually. She was never better than me because she was older. We were, you know, she was the mother. She was that figure. But she always, you know, I often came to my room and said, I'm sorry I said that. And I thought, you know, she was my influence, definitely.
How wonderful. Paul, did you have an early compassionate figure?
Not particularly. I mean, obviously, you know, one was cared for by one's parents and so forth. I mean, my parents were in the war, and tragically, my father was very traumatized, and so on. The consequences of that we know. So that was my background. But there have certainly been people in my life who have been incredibly compassionate to me. One person, I was doing my A-levels in economics. He was quite a stern person, actually. And anyway, so I did my exams and I failed. He called me into the office and he said, look, to be honest with you, your scores are not great, but you're much more talented than this. You know, if I put these through, you won't get, they're going to chuck you out of college, really. So I'm going to change the scores, but don't fail me. He changed my life, because had he failed me and I'd been chucked out, I wouldn't be where I am now. So I always look back on him as somebody, for my experience of compassion, who had a lot of faith in me and gave me a second chance. So he was quite a character, actually, and I played cricket with him and all kinds of things later on. But so that was something that was quite extraordinary. Of course, he could have been lying. I could have done fantastically well.
Yes.
I don't know. But so yeah, and I mean, of course, my parents tried their best and so on, as the parents do. And also I was very close to my older sister. So yeah, but I was also a boarding school person and so on. So that was my background.
With all that goes with that.
With all that goes with that.
I mean, obviously, Paul, you're an expert on this, and we are very interested at Useful and Kind, and in my own work as a therapeutic coach, on attachment. This idea that in our first 2 years of life, we get to be secure or not, according to the theory. And as it's our first experience of having folk be compassionate and forgiving to us or not, we've witnessed again recently the appalling results of the lack of secure attachment in the parents and the result on the parenting of young Arthur. I wonder how you think, Paul, first, attachment plays out in developing compassion and forgiveness for adults.
So great question. So we need to think about the process of attachment. I mean, we know attachment evolved to provide for the infant because they couldn't provide for themselves, the physical things like food and all of that. But John Bowlby and Mary Ainsman highlighted there's also psychological. And there are two key psychological. One is called a secure base, where the parents provide the opportunities for the child to learn, grow, to be encouraged, to feel loved, to play. And that's a kind of an arousing, engaging, the ability to engage the world with confidence. And the other function the attachment focuses on is called safe haven, which is the ability to feel soothed and calm down when you're distressed and also overexcited sometimes. So the point about it is, if you experience individuals who provide you this sense of confidence in yourself, that you are a lovable person, not only are you loved, but you are lovable, these are fantastic foundations to be able to deal with things that threaten you. And the ability to deal with forgiveness, I think, is very much linked to what Marina was saying. It's to do with how we deal with threat, things that have harmed us or frightened us. And as Marina was saying, you know, a common response when we've been hurt is vengeance. That is one of the most common responses. Anger is stimulated. So forgiveness is the ability to stand against that dark side of the mind, that natural desire to hurt back if somebody hurts you. There's an old saying, isn't there? Hurt people, hurt people. But if you've had this background and you have a grounding and an experience of being held and being a lovable as well as a loved individual, it gives you a framework for being able to think about the other in terms of, you know, what might have been happening for them and so forth. So I think it does give you a framework. The other framework, I think, that does come from forgiveness is a very different route. And this is when you yourself have been through things and then you have discovered and you've changed and you realize that what you did was not so good. So we do a lot of work in the prisons, as you know. We've got a big compassion program in the prisons here and in other countries. And that, when people begin to work with their own, quote, crimes or their own ways in which they've harmed people and come through it, they then can see what forgiveness is, partly because they experience forgiveness. So when you experience being forgiven, I think that can have quite an impact on your ability to be forgiving.
Yeah. I mean, Marina, in your experience of the many stories and relationships that have developed, Do you see any correlation between early experience and then the ability to have a sense of, as we would call it, mentalize, have a sense of the other person, to be compassionate towards them, or not?
Well, because I see myself as a facilitator of story and a teller of stories. I rely very much on the personal narrative and what people tell me. And I think by and large, exactly as Paul has said, what you learn from your parents, you take forward into your adult life. And therefore, if you have forgiving parents, it's much more likely you'll be more forgiving yourself. And if you're taught to have self-compassion, again, you're going to be more compassionate to others. But I think just to flip that, why are some people so cruel? Where does human cruelty come from? Is it always people who have been deprived of love and compassion and forgiveness in their early lives? And I couldn't speak necessarily to that, but just I can speak anecdotally from the many, many stories that I've collected. And I would say, I'll just use one example. You may know the story of Marion Partington, whose sister was killed by serial killers Fred and Rosemary West. When Fred West committed suicide before he went to trial, so Marion Partington has spent, decades really looking at forgiveness and what it means. She writes brilliantly about it. She unpicks and uncovers and explores it at great, great depth and beautifully. She's written a book about her sister and about her journey. But she describes how she went to the trial with Rosemary West and how she felt what she described as a flicker of compassion. And the flicker of compassion came because as she heard Rosemary West describe her childhood of depravity, of being raped, of not being loved, of being treated appallingly, Marion Partington understood the impoverishment of a soul who knew no other way of living than through terrible cruelty. Yeah. And it was like in that understanding that Marion came to eventually forgiving Rosemary West. But I think it's that what Shakespeare calls ruined pieces of nature, people who are capable of these appalling acts of what you might call evil and cruelty. And I think much of it must go back to early experience and how you come out wiring.
I'm sure Paul and I could talk for hours on this because it is absolutely central. The idea of, untreated trauma transmits, and that all abusers have been abused, but not all abused go on to abuse. And I think that's what Paul was really importantly touching on. I'm wondering if we kind of can bring it back to personal experience. And I'm wondering if you're willing to share an occasion when you've had to forgive someone and what your lived experience, without divulging who or what, just what your experience of that was. Paul, would you start?
Yes. I mean, just to pick up on Marina's point, which I think is an incredible point, I think that's true. But we must also recognize that cultures have been cruel. The issue of not all slavers have been abused. Not all people who enjoyed the Roman games were abused, and so on and so on. So there is another dimension to the dark side of the mind. To come back to your point, have I been forgiven? Sorry, what was the question? Have I been forgiven, or have I?
No, it's interesting. It's when have you had to forgive someone and what it was like?
Yes, I mean, we had a difficult. Let's just say we had one or two difficult things happening at boarding school, and that did require me to forgive those teachers. But yes, and the point is, what you do is you recognize that part of what traps you is angry vengeance. And I think Enright and Marina will speak more to this. Is one of the reasons you forgive is because you want to let go of your rage, and you just don't want it anymore. And you realize that your rage is a chain. So that is the beginning of the journey. And then you can then go on and think about trying to understand the person that was harmful to you or whatever. And so I think that's a really important point. And Enright did a lot of studies, didn't he, on the forgiveness of Holocaust victims and the processes that they went to, firstly acknowledging their rage and then realizing that rage was basically a poison. And so forgiveness was necessary for your own peace of mind. So people forgive for very different reasons, I think. But Marina would be much better to talk to that question than me. But those are some issues of how we forgive people who have been harmful.
I noticed how quickly you brushed over what I'm sure was the trauma of having to forgive teachers.
Yeah.
Marina, then, I'm going to ask you this question. Given the whole kind of Blair thing was so central to you, I wonder what it would be like for you to forgive Blair.
I think it's so much more difficult to forgive, administrations and political leaders. And I think it's perfectly okay not to forgive someone. You can have your limits.
Yes.
I found myself feeling more forgiving of Tony Blair, funnily enough, watching the series, the Blair and Brown Ears, or whatever it was called.
Yeah.
I sort of understood him a bit better, and therefore I felt a bit more compassion. But in answer to the question about has there been someone I have forgiven, there is, but it started off with not being forgiven by somebody, which was a very interesting experience. I did something to deeply offend someone, but they never told me what. And I was cut off. People are very good at exiling others, I find. Happens in families all the time. And it's the most cruel way of dealing with conflict. Sometimes it's necessary. Often, I think it's not. In my case, suddenly, overnight, no communication. So then I got angry. And it took years, because I spent several years trying to make up to this person. Every now and again, every 6 months, I'd send an email or a postcard. No response, no response. That got me angry. Then I had to let go of it, and I had to totally forgive him. And I then realized completely that you cannot, forgiveness is about not expecting others to behave as we want them to. And he had every right not to be my friend. I still don't know why, but I've let go of, the anger and the resentment about it. Whether he's let go of what he felt about me, I don't know. But it's very interesting, that experience of not being forgiven, even though you apologize humbly and sincerely.
Yes. How moving. I have a kind of funny personal story, which is that I was harmed professionally when a project, £90 million project I was running, got cut by the funder, who'd promised in writing that we would be given 58 million the day before parliamentary recess, and also a week before the birth of my second daughter. And you can imagine this was significant, not just for me as chief exec, but for others too. And it took me a very long time and a lot of therapy and therapeutic training to come to terms with this. And then I read much later on one of the Dalai Lama's books on happiness, which obviously pointed out that I was the one hanging on to it. And so I wrote to this person and gifted him the book and said that, I was clearly hanging on to this, and, I absolutely forgave him. And given it was a kind of potential legal situation, he wrote a very nice email saying that he would never have done it in the same way again. And that was closure for me. And 6 weeks later, he wrote to me, and because he'd been sacked, and asked, would I help him? And I thought that was a kind of nice sort of karma. But it leads me on to, obviously at Useful and Kind, we are, like many others, working on being compassionate to self, which many people aren't, being compassionate to others in 3 different categories. The easy ones, friends and loved ones, or they were easy before lockdown, the difficult ones, and then families and teams. And the difficult ones, we believe, is where real change can happen. And, whether that's just someone who slighted us or harmed us or bullied us in the workplace. And I just wonder what advice you both give to those who are struggling to find compassion for the difficult ones. Paul.
Okay, well, as you know, we make a distinction between kindness and compassion. We've actually done studies on this. So basically, compassion is sensitivity to suffering with a desire to do something about it. Kindness can be many things, like remembering your birthday or taking a special interest in you, and so on and so on. So it's quite possible to have compassion without having any interest in being kind.
Yes.
So the point is, let's assume there is somebody that you don't like, you don't particularly want to see them, you don't want to remember their birthday, you don't want to take them out for lunch, you don't want to do that. But supposing you found that you came across them and they'd been badly injured in a car accident, would you call the ambulance? That's the issue, right? Would you try to help them if they were in a state of suffering and pain? Okay, you don't need to like them or want to be kind to them, but so the key issue then in compassion is, do we have the courage and wisdom to address suffering where we see it in whoever? We don't need to like that person, we don't need to want to be kind to them, but if they're in a state of suffering, would we do something about it? So that's the issue of compassion, that it's basically focused on suffering in a way that kindness isn't actually so much. As you know, the Dalai Lama says it's more about well-being. Karuna in the traditions and metta are quite different. So if you hold this idea that compassion really is about the wish not to be harmful, to be helpful, not harmful, and that's really the key thing. It's all around not to be a source of suffering and to be an alleviator of suffering if you can. That's the basic of compassion. And that can take a lot of courage and wisdom, actually.
It can. And Marina, I know you are keen not to force forgiveness on people, but I wonder what advice you'd give people who are thinking about forgiveness or trying to be compassionate to, let's face it, some of the most difficult people. What advice do you give them?
Well, the only tool I really work with is storytelling and story sharing, because I think you can read books, you can hear experts, you can know practices, but actually it's a shortcut. It's an extraordinarily powerful tool, storytelling. And I think listening to the pain of others builds compassion. It can't help but build compassion because all pain is similar. And so that's why I see storytelling as this sort of vital teaching tool, because it helps us reach out and care for others. And therefore that makes the world a safer place, ultimately. Stories can reach across rifts. You can think you've got nothing in common, but it can reach across the rifts of geography, of gender, of race, of enemies. And I think it was Sarah Roy who said both her parents were Holocaust survivors, and she was a psychologist. And she said compassion, tolerance, and justice cannot be practiced or extended when one lives only among one's own. So what she's really talking about, if you just live within people like us, it's easy to feel compassion and empathy. But this is what I'm trying to do with the Forgiveness Project, trying to share stories that are different, stories with people from different cultures, which really push you beyond those boundaries, because it's easy for our heartstrings to be tugged on if it's people that we relate easily to, but it's very difficult otherwise. And how do we do it? And I think stories are the way. And I also love what the poet Rilke said. As he grew older, he understood this, and he said, I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. It was a beautiful description of a compassionate way of being, I think.
It's a really interesting link, Marina. We did another podcast with David Seamas, who's chief exec of the Obama Foundation, because Obama is our founding father because he came up with Useful and Kind. And he talked with the first British fellow of the Obama Foundation about the massive importance of storytelling and sharing stories across difference. I'm wondering what you both feel about the kind of massive push towards kindness. I mean, our Instagram feeds and Twitter are absolutely full of be kind. At Useful and Kind, we often give the example of Rosa Parks, of if she knew then what we know now, she'd feel anger, she'd know where that was located in her body, she'd feel compassion for the person asking her to stand up. Should you have stood up? No, of course not. And so for us, the compassion also moves into social action with positive disruptors, as we would call them, those people who can demonstrate to those they disagree with in a compassionate way that there is a better way. You know, you look at the history of the abolitionists, the suffragettes, and so on. And I wonder if you're feeling that the world has moved a bit towards the kind of soft, fluffy kindness rather than the tough stuff of compassion and action. Marina.
Um, so the honest answer is I don't know. I don't know if there's been a change. I do think there's a huge difference. And it's funny, when I was driving up, trying to, because I always take things back to stories. My stories are other people's stories. It's how I understand the world. And I was thinking about my mother because of the question you asked. And you see, I think she was kind, but I'm not sure how compassionate she was. Because one of the things she used to do is, having been brought up like she was, you would think she wouldn't like people. Like, if she went to a smart dinner party, she'd always go into the kitchen to talk to the staff. Now, was that compassionate or was that kind? Well, I don't think it was compassionate because the staff were not suffering. But most people like her would have not gone into the kitchen and talked to the staff. So I think compassionate, as Paul was saying, is, it's action, and it's based on the building conversations and action between people who have suffered, and it's about suffering. But it's much easier to be kind. That's what I feel. But I think Paul's thought a lot more about this than I have. But I don't often talk about kindness, funny enough. And so it's a sort of new way of me thinking about this whole big subject. So I'm interested in what Paul has to say. Could be more articulate than me, please.
Well, I think what you said earlier, Marina, is absolutely right. That if we just with our own kind and it's all very easy and we're all loving and caring and stuff, that's kindness it's easy, compassion is relatively easy. But the point you made is that when you extend it out beyond those boundaries to the people that you're not so familiar with, that might not reciprocate, that could be frightening to you, now that's a different story. So when you ask about are we becoming fluffy with kindness, it's all to do with how you define it, you see, because kindness can be a bit fluffy and a bit woozy and gives you a good feeling, but that's quite nice, isn't it? To have somebody be kind to you and it gives you a good feeling. There's nothing wrong with being fluffy, but is there more to it than a bit of fluffy? Well, as you know, of course there is, because what we know is that kindness also creates positive relationships. It cements bonds. It creates trust. There's a lot of really important things that kindness will do in relationships, whereas unkind and unthoughtfulness, that isn't such a good thing in relationships. So it's a wonderful thing in relationships, and it's a kind of a thoughtfulness about the needs and how to help the other flourish and so forth. The other thing I think is quite important is tolerance, and how kindness can be rooted in tolerance, learning to be more tolerant of difference. So I think, in the last 50 years, we've become much more tolerant of LGBT and so on and so on. Our ability to be open and to allow without closing down, I think that's not fluffy at all. That's really very, very important. And out of that ability to be tolerant, then we take an interest in the well-being of the other. Perhaps we weren't tolerant previously, but now we are tolerant. So we can be interested not only to prevent suffering, but also to help the other flourish. And kindness is very much about helping others flourish, to feel joy and to feel happiness. So I think, yes, kindness can be very fluffy, and that's okay, but it's a lot more than that too. And I think it's understanding the depths of kindness rather than just a superficial understanding. It's about remembering your birthday and buying you fairy cakes or something.
Yes. I mean, I think we've talked about those who do harm in sort of obvious ways, but often when I work with people, certainly in the workplace, and they are suffering with a narcissist boss, and just if you begin to explain the process of narcissism to them, and if you can help them understand and feel compassion towards the child who was, not loved in a certain way, and all of that led to the narcissism, it can create a much deeper, richer understanding. Doesn't make it any easier necessarily to live with them, but I think that's really important. I just want to end by noticing that since your book, Paul, in 2009 and Marina, yours in 2015, the world's got far less compassionate and forgiving. We've lived through, a political move to the right, fake news. We've lived through COVID and we saw great pro-sociality to start with, but then less. I'm wondering kind of two things really. One, do you see any signs of hope? And how do you keep yourselves going in these tough times? Marina.
Yes, to the answer, the question about hope. I mean, I think hope is both a state of mind and an orientation of the heart. And I think what I love about it is it's strongest in the darkest of places. So I feel we are, as you suggest, in a very dark place right now. And therefore, hope is brighter than ever. That's a sort of personal philosophy of mine, and I'm sure some people would disagree. But it is what keeps me going, and what keeps me going is the extraordinary people I've worked with along the way with the Forgiveness Project. Because people often say to me, "How can you take all those stories, of trauma, of pain, of atrocity, of perpetrators, and murders?" And I say because every one of them is what I call a restorative narrative, a story that focuses on recovery and hope and compassion and empathy and reconciliation and forgiveness. Every one of them, these people may have suffered greatly, but they've found meaning in the suffering. And they've, in many ways, often used that suffering to help others. So it's immensely hopeful. And there are so many stories out there like that, if you look.
Wonderful. Paul, any signs of hope, and how do you keep yourself going?
Yes, fantastic amount of hope. Look, all of these social changes, it's like a tide coming in. The waves go in, the waves go out. You think, oh, you got more water. Now you haven't, because the wave's gone out again. So that's how these things move. It's like a breath, right? So if you look over the last 100 years, I think there's no question that we are a much more compassionate society. But of course, there is also how politicians play on fear. That's the big issue. Politicians play on fear, and they can stimulate the dark side. They stimulate tribalism. They turn off empathy for the other, because the other is seen as a threat, or the other is seen as requiring things I can't afford to give them. Like some of our attitudes to immigrants is really quite atrocious, actually. But on the whole, I think, as in general, there's quite a lot of grounds to be optimistic. We're seeing mindfulness in schools now. We're seeing compassion training in schools now. We do work with businesses. Businesses are beginning to become aware that, we need businesses that will support humanity, not harm it. And in fact, with many of the younger businessmen, particularly those business people, I beg your pardon, particularly those under the age of 40, they say, yes, I want to be an entrepreneur, but I want to do something that's useful. I don't want to, and we're beginning to turn against fossil fuels and so on and so on. So I think in many areas, there are some fantastic changes going on. Politics is the one area where actually things are not so good. And part of the reason for that is because our political systems are really not fit for purpose now. We need to have a society which is cooperative. All our political systems are set up to be competitive, rivalrous. And it's not only is it rivalrous in a sense of trying to get the best, competition can be like the Olympic Games where you compete to see who's the best and so on, the best idea or whatever. That's okay. It's the competition of undermining. The political systems are about undermining your opponents, showing them to be stupid or ridiculous or dangerous or whatever it is. And it's a poison. Politics and politicians have got themselves caught up in a system of poisoning each other, and that is not good. But on the other hand, we have groups like Compassion in Politics who are making these things very clear. And I think some of the younger politicians themselves are beginning to realize, hang on a minute, we can't continue like this. We can't continue with just stimulating the right-wing media so that we, because they get us fighting with each other, and then they sell the blood on the carpet, don't they? And there they are, this is great, let's watch you fight. That is a dark side. But there's a lot to do in political movements and how the right-wing media and how people are moved by fear and threat. We've seen it in America, we've seen it here, and so on and so on. But around it, underneath it, I think we are becoming more compassionate. We are becoming more tolerant, more understanding, and more compassionate. And yes, you're right. Of course, there was a big outpouring of compassion in the first wave of COVID, but it's still basically there. I mean, if you look at people in the NHS and so forth, they're still highly motivated. You know, people are very motivated to do good, not just to do bad. And if you look at in any community, most people are friendly rather than hostile. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of hope, but the big issue is politics and the media. That they do have a serious dark side, and they're getting worse.
Well, it's good to know that.
Sorry. I just wanted to say, Paul, it might be worth signposting listeners to the book that came out last week that we both have a chapter in, which is sort of organised by Compassion in Politics. I think there's a lot of hope in that book as well.
Great.
Yes, terrific.
Excellent. And we have a lot of hope in the young people we work with, both with the Useful and Kind schools and with the young people who come on summer schools. So I want to say a huge thank you to our guests, Paul and Marina, for all they're doing to make it a better world. To our producer, Hannah Johnson, and to you for being with us. May you all be happy, well, and free from suffering. And may you be able to dig deep into your own compassion and love to offer it to yourselves, others, and the world. Please check us out on our website and follow us on Twitter and Insta. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day. Till next time, be useful and kind.